Good evening, and this evening Ngakpa Nor'dzin is going to talk to us about Dza Patrul Rinpoche.
Thank you very much. Tonight we have a story and a story about stories, which I hope you will find interesting because they concern different approaches to teaching. Dza Patrul Rinpoche lived from 1808 to 1887, and he was born in eastern Tibet. He was recognized as an incarnation of Palge Tulku, a lama from Dzogchen monastery, and was entrusted with the Longchen Nyingtig lineage by Dodrupchen Rinpoche. And his two main teachers in his lifetime were Jigme Gyalwa Nyugu and Dokensei Yeshidoje. Dza Patrul decided he wouldn't remain at Dzogchen Monastery, and at the age of 20, he took up the life of a wandering hermit. And for the rest of his life, he wandered from place to place, sometimes to monasteries, always practicing, always teaching. And throughout his life, he exemplified the life of both a siddha and a scholar. He kept few possessions, had no fixed abode, and was often mistaken for a beggar due to his humble appearance. The stories that we have of the life of Dza Patrul Rinpoche come from Ngakchen Rinpoche's teacher, Kyabje Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, who would use these stories as a method of teaching Ngakchen Rinpoche, because he would tell a story and then ask Ngakchen Rinpoche questions about the meanings of the stories. And in the early days of their association, Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche would be most fierce in terms of his questions and how he dealt with Ngakchen Rinpoche's answers. And this was his method of teaching. And to find out more about this, if you read the book Wisdom Eccentrics by Ngakchen Rinpoche, you'll hear not only more of the stories, but also the stories about how the stories we use as a method of teaching. Kyabje Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche said part of Dza Patrul's personality display was to fall in with situations, simply in order that people would experience their own patterning. So essentially, he gave people the opportunity to learn something, and to learn something for themselves rather than to be taught something as an academic subject or something that might eventually give them a clue. So there's a sense of immediacy and there's a sense of personal experience, which I think has many people will have understood. There's nothing like understanding something for yourself from your own experience, as opposed to something that somebody might have told you is a good idea. So it's very powerful, very direct form of teaching. Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche also said to Ngakchen Rinpoche, you have to be creative with your intelligence, but not too creative. Patrul said just enough for the results of his actions to have an effect. You have to be highly precise in order to act in this way. You can't always know what will happen. Mostly you have to go into emptiness and simply see what happens. And Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche said to Ngakchen Rinpoche, you will have to do this so many times. So we have one example tonight of a story of Dza Patrul, and then the conversation that ensued as a result of this between Ngakpa Rinpoche and Kyabje Dorje Rinpoche, and how that proceeded as a form of teaching. And unlike other versions of these stories that you may find, these have been written by Ngakpa Rinpoche, and in a sort of Western, well, definitely Western, wild Western approach to telling these stories, as that approach really fitted the situation in Eastern Tibet in terms of how the people were in that place. So if it reads like a Western, then that's absolutely intended. Dza Patrul caught a sound on the wind. There were horsemen in the distance. Hardly an unusual occurrence, but Patrul took special note of them and sat on the ground to await their arrival as the horses shambled across the plain. He made himself comfortable in the exact middle of the track on which he had been walking, having reached a juncture at which the path plunged through a narrow defile between outcrops of rock. Not the kind of place to avoid being seen or to hide from brigands. He watched the approach of the riders as they emerged out of the blur of the horizon, first as an agglomeration of colours, then gradually as 4 distinct horsemen. After a while, it became apparent that they were a group of young men from one of the fierce feuding tribes of Golok. They wore rifles slung over their shoulders. Their belts were slung with knives and swords. Chinese and Mongolian blades of various shapes and sizes caught the sun and flashed. The riders in turn spotted the lone, shaggy individual sitting in their path and sensed something slightly peculiar about the situation. Why was someone sitting in the middle of the track? Why did he not move when it was evident that he had observed their approach? Could it be that this was a challenge? Or was the old man insane? There was about enough room for 2 horses to pass abreast through the defile, but with an old Ngakpa occupying the central position, even to pass him on one side or the other would need to be undertaken with care. The horses trotted in leisurely manner towards Patrul, but he showed no sign of moving aside. The horseman halted momentarily some short distance away and sat looking quizzically at the imperturbable character who held the road before them. It was now obvious to them that he had no intention of moving. So they exchanged a few jocular comments between themselves. Their horses champed, whinnied, and tore up tussocks of grass. Patrul simply gazed at them without speaking, and an uneasy abeyance ensued, suddenly to be shattered as the riders reared their horses, broke into a gallop, and charged down the ravine. Patrul sat perfectly still in the swirling dust as the horses thundered by on either side, their hooves cutting close enough that a stray clip could have smashed his skull. Having passed by, the 4 riders wheeled round to observe the effect of their charge. Patrul had not moved. A second wary hiatus followed. "Old ragbag," called the foremost rider, "have you no fear, or are you a fool?" Patrul placed a hand on the ground behind him and leaned back on his arm. He gave the impression of luxuriating in the slow leisureliness of the movement. He inclined his face towards them obliquely, as if he had no real interest in giving them his full attention. Fear, he replied, as if he was unfamiliar with the word. He peered inside his sheepskin coat, as if he might find some fear there. No, can't say as I have any fear. But as to foolishness, well, I'll just have to leave that to your undoubted intelligence. The horseman's amused expressions froze slightly on hearing these words. Was this an ambush? Were there warriors hiding to be called forth at this man's command? They squinted into the sun. They were not used to this kind of reply, and although Paltrul's words hadn't disturbed them overmuch, they could not immediately come up with a neat retort. So Paltrul tossed out a suggestion in an offhand way. Perhaps you're afraid. Leastways, seems you can't manage to look at me with open eyes. That prompted a yell from the riders, who bore down on him again, coating Paltrul with another layer of dust. Paltrul turned slowly to face the men again, and this time he was facing the sun. If we weren't the finest horsemen in Golok, you'd be a dead old man. Paltrul did not seem very impressed. Is that a fact? He yawned, with somewhat massive disinterest. The horseman did not fail to notice that Paltrul was observing him with unblinking eyes, even though he was staring directly into the sun. They observed each other coolly while the dust settled. Do you still have no fear? Paltrul smiled. Don't reckon I do. What about you? I see at least you can keep your eyes open now. The rider found himself balanced on a taut emotional wire between amusement and anger. He was beginning to find this exchange intriguing. You run your mouth pretty reckless for a man that doesn't carry weapons. Even this close to death, you still say you have no fear? Paltrul's reply was immediate. What is there in death that I should fear? Unlike you, I have nothing to gain or lose. The horseman began to wonder whether he was addressing some old warrior or some religious type, and replied, You have your life to lose, my friend. But Paltrul retorted sharply, What is my life or yours but a bubble in the current of a stream, or the flickering of a candle flame? The tone of this exchange was beginning to wax mystical, and the young man was beginning to feel slightly strange, as if he wasn't quite sure of where the course of events was going to lead. He asked, So, if you don't fear us, and you have no fear of death, tell me, what do you fear? Paltrul cast his gaze regretfully towards the ground. There you have me, he sighed. I do have one terrible fear. I fear that I may not be able to bring peace to those families whose need for revenge causes such suffering in these parts. This was a totally unexpected answer and caused the riders grand curiosity and slight unease. Maybe this really was some sort of drubtop sitting on the ground in front of them. But if so, why did he conduct himself like a desperado? They were not used to religious types having such an accentuated degree of swagger or bravado. But this one behaved with the downright arrogance of a brigand's chieftain. That's quite an interesting answer, Ame. Who are you? Ame means venerable ancient. Why do you sit here and let us ride round you? And how do you come to speak with the authority of a chieftain? Paltrul placed his hands on his knees and replied, I am a small child of awareness. I sit here merely to inconvenience you with the conversation of an old man. I have no authority other than that which places my motivation outside the realm of your comprehension. But what of your authority? I sense that yours may be the power to rid me of my one terrible fear. The horseman was now teetering between fascination and bewilderment. And, he asked, just how can I do that, Ame? He inquired in exasperated but reverential incredulity. It was then that Paltrul shouted out aloud, "Ha!" and followed on. That is entirely up to you. You command your life and the lives of many others. You who have no fear, ride on out of here. Do whatever lies within your power. I have nothing more to say. At this, the three other riders reared their horses for another charge, but their leader raised his hand to hold them back. The sun dipped in the distance, and Paltrul swung himself round in order to allow the riders to pass. They walked their horses down into the defile, giving Paltrul a wide berth. Once past him, they broke into a trot, a canter, and eventually galloped into the distance. Their leader stopped at the head of the ridge and looked back for a moment, but Paltrul was gone. He was nowhere to be seen on the road, and it was as if the horseman had dreamed the whole episode. They rode home in silence and never spoke of their meeting. Paltrul never saw the young men again, but later he came to hear that the blood feud in Markog, which had lasted over a century, had been ended. The families had made an agreement to put aside their long-held disputes and bitterness in order to coexist without continual bloodshed. Then we return to Ngakpa Rinpoche's narrative. He says, "This time I had an idea." "Rinpoche," I chimed in almost immediately his story had ended. It seemed that Paltrul was showing these warriors a face they could recognize. A face they could understand. He was completely fearless, like a warrior, but he also spoke in a haughty way. I can understand him showing lack of fear as a way of communicating, but I don't understand why he displayed what seemed to be arrogance. He obviously wanted to bring peace to the area and to influence the leader of the warriors to end the blood feud, but I would have thought that his aggressive stance would have made an obstacle rather than aiding his intention. There must be some reason why Paltrul was speaking in this way. Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche made no comment on what I said, but asked, "What is so interesting about a man who is fearless about sitting in the path of charging horses, apart from fearlessness?" Suddenly my mind went blank, and all I could do was repeat the question internally. What was so interesting about a man who is fearless about sitting in the path of charging horses, apart from fearlessness? I really couldn't think of anything, apart from why. "Well," I answered, "I guess it might be interesting why someone would do that." Rinpoche nodded. "So why doesn't Paltrul tell them why he is there? If he wants to show them that he is brave and he wants them to stop the feud, why doesn't he simply tell them?" For once, the whole thing clicked together for me. It's the interest, isn't it? Paltrul needs to keep the warrior interested for long enough to make him question himself. I suddenly realized what a brilliant strategy this was. Keep the warrior interested, keep him guessing, make it worth his while to ask questions. Cause him just enough offense to be intrigued, and only then introduce the idea that he might be a yogi. Rinpoche seemed pleased with my analysis for once, and I began to get the feeling that I was getting somewhere with these stories and my effort to get behind them. But then a further question occurred to me. There was still the issue of why Patrul concluded his exchange by saying, "You command your own life and the lives of others. You who have no fear, ride on out of here and do whatever lies within your power." Why had he said that when the warrior had asked him point blank how he could allay Patrul's fear? Why didn't Patrul simply grasp the opportunity by giving him some suggestions on how he could play a part in ending the feud? Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche laughed at this. "You don't know warriors. You don't know Goloks or Kambas either," he said. "You don't give advice to warriors or use unnecessary words. It would have been weakness for Patrul to have made a request. Instead, he showed confidence that the warrior would know what was best to do, saying, 'You command your own life and the lives of others.'" This was a fascinating perspective, and it triggered a flood of ideas as to how the rest of Patrul's actions might have unraveled. So perhaps it was important that Patrul didn't give advice to the warrior in front of his own tribesmen. Otherwise, they could have seen him as following the dictates of a stranger. And that would have hindered actions that the warrior may have tried putting into effect. Rinpoche nodded as I spoke and poured out 2 beers. I thought, as was often the case, that the pouring of beers was the conclusion of our discussion. But Rinpoche went further. "You know," he said, "it's not always good to give advice in specific about how things should be done. It's not always wise to supply every detail. If advice is given that leaves no room for maneuver, you make everything into form, and then form becomes emptiness. Sometimes it's better to allow emptiness in order for the form of compassion to arise according to circumstances that are out of your control." I thought about this for a moment. But wouldn't the warrior have benefited from Patrul's wisdom in terms of finding a way to end the feud? Rinpoche shook his head. Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, it's a fool who doesn't make use of the fact that everyone has their own knowledge. Patrul, wise as he was, could not know every part of every situation. He had to trust to emptiness. Maybe you will often find yourself in situations where there is too much you cannot understand. At such times, you may have to trust in giving generalized guidance and incomplete directions. Sometimes there are no good answers to human problems, and sometimes there are too many. Then Rinpoche told me of another story in which Patrul had brought about the end of a blood feud in Golok by lying across a path. Apparently, the warriors in the second story asked Patrul whether he was sick or whether he was an imbecile. Patrul replied that he was sane but sick. But, he said, it's not the kind of sickness that would be contagious to brave young warriors like you, nor is it the sort of sickness from which I would ever want to recover. The young warriors laughed, asking, "What sort of damn sickness is this then?" To which Patrul replied, "Oh, nothing so terrible, just the sickness of kindness towards all beings." This statement resulted in the young men doing whatever they could to end the feud as before. "So," Rinpoche asked, "which story do you prefer?" I told him I preferred the first one. He naturally went on to asking why, and so I said there was more in the story to think about. "Ah," he replied, "kindness is not such a shock to you. Maybe you've already caught this sickness." I laughed very loudly at this, quite surprising myself, and said, "I hope so." Whenever I remember this story, I look at my life for symptoms of this rare disease, and whatever signs of health I exhibit cause me to do whatever I can to stimulate new areas of infection. The most saddening part of life for me is to witness immunity to the disease of kindness, either in myself or others. Although I initially preferred the first story, the second has caused me to reflect a great deal on the nature of kindness and how it can be encouraged in the world. The idea of kindness as an illness, with all its attendant concepts of infection and contagion, is very creative. The manner of expression is a brilliant example of how Tantra turns language on its head. It uses violent rage to describe clarity and sickness to describe health. So we can wish now that everyone and everything everywhere is infected with the disease of kindness towards all beings.
Have you got a note that we can tell them of whereabouts in the book that story is, in case they want to look it up?
No,
You didn't make a note?
I didn't make a note, no. But you'll find it in Wisdom Eccentrics without too much trouble, I'm sure.
Wisdom Eccentrics is published by Aro Books Inc, which is in America. So you can find their website if you want to get a hold of the book. It's a marvelous book, it really is.
Yes, it's a wonderful book. It's descriptive of a point in time, both in terms of Ngakma Rinpoche's life and particular times in the East, particularly in northern India. So it's a wonderful exposition of both the method of teaching that Ngakma Rinpoche received and the time and place in which that happened.
And there are also some stories about Ngakpa Chögyam Rinpoche later on in the book, which are also extraordinary in a different way.
Yeah. And
his relationship with that teacher and his style of approaching teachings.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting thing, is that teachers have their styles and they can differ quite markedly. And this comes through very strongly in that book. There is no one way of teaching because it depends on the teacher and the student and the circumstances.
And I find it interesting, often these discussions with Ngakpa Chögyam Rinpoche, because it's when Ngakpa Rinpoche is starting out as a teacher, and it's advice at the level of beginning to teach, and people will ask for advice in their life and things like that. And it's often, I'll remember a story if somebody's asking, one of our students, for example, is asking a question. It's not always the obvious answer that is the right answer, and it's not always appropriate to actually give advice, but to present maybe alternative ways of looking at a situation so that the advice arises. And I think that comes through in this story.
Yes.
Particularly.
Yeah, I think that each person has their own situation and knowledge of that situation, and each person can find their own wisdom in that situation. So by not detailing everything, the teacher is actually indicating a confidence that the student understands enough of their situation and enough of Dharma to be able to work things out.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.